So good evening and welcome. My name is Melanie Wooden. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to this lecture series this evening. As you know, this is the inaugural Martin Lecture, the first of what I'm sure will be a very successful lecture series. But before I introduce today's speaker, I want to spend a few minutes talking about the Martin family, whose generous donation has made this lecture series possible. There are more than a dozen Martin family members in attendance with us today, including the late Ron and Mary's children, Anne, John, and Peter, and their grandchildren. I'm so glad that you're here to celebrate with us today. Now, many of you are already familiar with the Martin family because they're really quite synonymous with U of T. Their extraordinary legacy gift to the faculty, the Mary Louise and Robert Laidlaw Martin Graduate Scholarships, provide financial support to graduate students studying astronomy and astrophysics, ecology and evolutionary biology, physics, and public policy. You may wonder what these four subjects share in common. They're the areas of study and the careers of Mary and Ron's children. The Faculty of Arts and Science created the Martin Lecture Series to honor the Martin family in establishing these scholarships. Ron and Mary sent all four of their children to U of T, who in turn sent all of their children. In fact, since the late 1800s, some 60 members of the family have studied here. That's 5 generations. I'm sure you'll agree, that's truly remarkable. 2 of Mary and Ron's children came back as professors and have productive and distinguished careers. John is a professor emeritus of physics, and Peter, a professor in the Department of Astronomy and Astrophysics, founded not one, but 2 institutes of astronomy at U of T. Ron and Mary's other children, Anne and Jim, are also U of T graduates, of course. Anne devoted her career to public policy, and Jim to a career in teaching. And now, among the grandchildren, there are 2 PhDs, a doctor, a lawyer, a teacher, and a public policy expert. I can only imagine what the dinner conversation is around the Thanksgiving table. Who wouldn't love to be a part of that? This legacy gift from Ron and Mary represents all the great qualities that we see in donors: a passionate love of learning and a desire to invest in the next generation of scholars. The Martins will enable the Faculty of Arts and Science to offer graduate scholarships that attract brilliant students from across Canada and around the world, and continue the Martin family legacy of excellence. Again, thank you to the Martin family. Now, speaking of excellence, I'm pleased to introduce tonight's speaker. Professor Martin Rees, Baron Rees of Ludlow, is the United Kingdom's Astronomer Royal. For the past 50 years, Lord Rees has contributed to our understanding of cosmology. Now, he's sharing his vision about the promise and the potential dangers of the science and technology that will arrive over the next 50 years and beyond. Based at Cambridge University, he has been director of the Institute of Astronomy and master of Trinity College. He is a crossbencher in UK's House of Lords and was president of the Royal Society from 2005 to 2010. The recipient of many international awards, he continues to write and broadcast widely for general audiences. His books include Our Final Century, Our Cosmic Habitat, Gravity's Fatal Attraction, and most recently, On the Future, Prospects for Humanity. I should also mention that Lord Rees is no stranger to the Martin family, having been Peter Martin's supervisor when he studied at Cambridge. So please join me in welcoming our very first Martin Lecture speaker, Lord Martin Rees.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great privilege and pleasure to be the first Martin lecturer. As has been said, I know one member of the family particularly well, indeed for 50 years. He's a world expert on interstellar dust, and what little I know about that arcane subject has come from talking to Peter Martin. So I'm very grateful to him for that. As was said, I'm the Astronomer Royal, and I was once, several times I've been asked, does that mean that you do the Queen's horoscopes? And I respond with a straight face, if she wanted one, I'm the person she'd ask. And one person in particular was very keen to hear my predictions. I told him stocks will fluctuate, there'll be trouble in the Middle East and other surprising things like that. And he paid rapt attention until I came clean and said, I'm actually just an astronomer and a scientist. And he then lost all interest in my predictions. And rightly so, because scientists are rotten forecasters, almost as bad as economists, but not quite. And an earlier Astronomer Royal said in 1956 that space travel was utter bilge. So my forecast will be very tentative, especially in front of an audience here where there are people with far more expertise than me on many of the topics I'll address. 14 years ago, I wrote a book which I entitled Our Final Century, ? But the publishers took out the question mark, and the American publishers changed the title to Our Final Hour, as Americans like instant gratification and the reverse. And that book rather typecast me as a doomster and Luddite. But I tried to counter that in my new book called On the Future, Prospects for Humanity, where I try to offer scientific optimism despite some political pessimism. And this should be available in all good bookstores. The main theme of the book is that this century is special. Our Earth's existed for 45 million centuries. But this century is the first when one species, ours, has its future in its hands. We're deep in the Anthropocene. We could irreversibly degrade the biosphere. On the other hand, we could trigger the transition from biological to electronic intelligence. Or misdirected technology could cause a catastrophic setback to civilization. The stakes are very high. We've, of course, had one lucky escape already. At any time during the Cold War era, when armament levels escalated beyond all reason, the superpowers could have stumbled towards Armageddon through muddle or miscalculation. And that threat is merely in abeyance. Nuclear weapons are based on 20th century science, but I'll focus later in my talk on 21st century sciences: biotech, cyber, robotics, and space. These offer huge potential benefits, but they also expose us to novel vulnerabilities. But before that, let's focus on some things we can predict, some long-term threats that stem not from conscious decisions, but from humanity's ever heavier collective footprint. And even with a cloudy crystal ball, there are some things we can predict. For instance, by mid-century, the world will be more crowded. 50 years ago, world population was about 3.5 billion. It's now about 7.7 billion. The growth's been mainly in Africa and Asia, as is shown in this map, where regions are scaled in proportion to the growth during the last 25 years. But the number of births worldwide per year peaked a few years ago and is going down. Nonetheless, world population is still going up and is forecast to reach 9 billion by mid-century. That's partly because most people in the developing world are young. They're yet to have children, and they will live longer. The age histogram in the developing world, on the left, will become more like it is in Europe, where those now young will live longer. The main growth is now in East Asia, and it's there that the world's human and financial resources will become concentrated, ending 4 centuries of North Atlantic hegemony. And there's more urbanization, and to prevent megacities becoming turbulent dystopias will surely be a major challenge to governance. Population growth seems actually under-discussed, partly perhaps because doom-laden forecasts by, for instance, the Club of Rome nearly 50 years ago proved off the mark. Also, some deem it to be a taboo subject, tainted by association with eugenics, with Indian policies under Indira Gandhi, and more recently with China's hardline one-child policy. But as it's turned out, food production and resource extraction have kept pace with the doubling of world population over the last 50 years. Famines still occur, but they are due to conflict or maldistribution, not to overall scarcity. The world couldn't sustain its present population if everyone lived as profitably as the better off Americans do today, each using as much energy as they do and eating as much beef as they do. On the other hand, 20 billion people could probably live sustainably with a very ascetic quality of life if they all had a vegan diet, travel little, lived in small high-density apartments, and interacted via super internet and virtual reality. This scenario is plainly improbable and not alluring, but the spread between these two extremes indicates that it's naive to quote one single headline figure for the world's carrying capacity. But to feed 9 billion people by mid-century will require improved agriculture, low-till, water conserving, and GM crops. And maybe dietary innovations, converting insects, highly nutritious and rich in proteins, into palatable food, and making artificial meat. To quote Gandhi, there's enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. Population trends beyond 2050 are harder to predict. Enhanced education and empowerment of women, surely a benign priority in itself, could reduce fertility rates where they're now highest. And the demographic transition hasn't reached part of India and sub-Saharan Africa. This is the biggest uncertainty, because if families in Africa remain large, then according to the UN predictions, that continent's population could double again by 2100, from 2 billion in 2050 to 4 billion in 2100, thereby raising the world's population to 11 billion. Nigeria alone would then have as big a population as Europe and North America combined, and Africa's population would be nearly 10 times Western Europe's. Well, optimists say that each extra mouth brings 2 hands and a brain. But it's the geopolitical stresses that would be most worrying in that scenario. Sub-Saharan Africa can't escape poverty as the Asian tigers did, by undercutting Western manufacturing costs. Robots can do that now. And they don't have sanitation in parts of Africa, but they do have smartphones. So they know the injustice of their fate. They know what they're missing. And migration is easy. That's a recipe for instability. Multiple mega versions of the tragic boat people crossing the Mediterranean today. So wealthy nations, especially in Europe, should urgently promote growing prosperity in Africa, and not just for altruistic reasons. And another thing, if humanity's collective impact on land use and climate pushes too hard, the resultant ecological shock could irreversibly impoverish our biosphere. Extinction rates are rising. We are destroying the book of life before we've read it. Already, there's more biomass in chickens and turkeys than in all the world's wild birds. And the biomass in humans, cows, and domestic animals is 20 times that in wild mammals. Biodiversity is crucial to human well-being. But for many environmentalists, preserving the richness of our biosphere has value in its own right, over and above what it means to us humans. To quote the great Harvard ecologist E.O. Wilson, mass extinction is the sin that future generations will least forgive us for. So the world's getting more crowded. And the second firm prediction, it'll gradually get warmer. This is the famous Keeling curve, which shows the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's rising mainly due to the burning of fossil fuels. And the seasonal oscillations are because there's more vegetation in the northern than the southern hemisphere. So CO2 goes up in the autumn and down in the northern spring. The fifth IPCC report, updated more recently, presented a spread of projections for future temperature rises, depending on different assumptions about future rates of fossil fuel use. And there's still uncertainty in the science. We know what CO2 can do, but we don't know to what extent those effects are amplified by associated changes in water vapor and cloud cover. That's a further uncertainty, and that's indicated by the bars on the right, which indicate the uncertainty in each of the four different colored graphs. However, despite these uncertainties, there are two messages that most would agree on. First, regional disruptions to weather patterns in the next 20 years or so, and more extreme weather, will aggravate pressures on food and water and enhance migration pressure. Second, under business as usual scenarios, we can't rule out, later in the century, really catastrophic warming and tipping points triggering long-term trends, like the melting of Greenland's ice cap. But even those who accept these two statements, and aren't climate deniers, as it were, they have diverse views on the policy response. And these divergences stem from differences in economics and ethics, in particular in how much obligation we should feel towards future generations. If, as Lomborg's Copenhagen Consensus does, you apply a standard discount rate to the future, 5% per year or something, then you give no weight to what happens after 2050. But many people feel that's the wrong way to do it, that you should not discriminate on grounds of date of birth and care as much about the life chances of a baby born today, who'll still be alive in 2100, as to those who are now middle-aged. And, of course, if you take that view, then you will feel that it's worthwhile, indeed imperative, to pay an insurance premium now to reduce a possible risk to those in the second half of the century. Possible utter catastrophe in the worst case. Well, what will actually happen on the climate policy front? Politicians won't gain much resonance by advocating unwelcome lifestyle changes or a high carbon tax, when the benefits will accrue mainly to distant parts of the world and the decades in the future. But there's one win-win roadmap to a low-carbon future, which is cleaner energy sources. And nations should accelerate research and development into all forms of low-carbon energy generation, and also into other technologies where parallel process is crucial, especially storage, batteries, compressed air, pumped storage, flywheels, etc., and smart grids. The point is that the faster these clean technologies advance, the sooner will their prices fall, so they become affordable to, for instance, India, where more generating capacity will be needed, where the health of the poor is currently jeopardized by smoky stoves burning wood and dung, and where, if clean energy is too expensive, there'll be pressure to build coal-fired power stations. Sun and wind are, of course, front runners for clean energy, but other methods, tidal and geothermal, for instance, have geographical niches. And also, because of local intermittency in sun and wind in particular, we'll need continental-scale DC grids to carry solar energy from the sunny southern latitudes to the cloudier north, and also east-west to smooth over peak demand in different time zones. You need this in North America, and one would hope that this could be developed in Eurasia all the way along the Chinese Belt and Road, from Europe to China. And despite wide ambivalence about nuclear energy, I think it's worthwhile to enhance R&D into a variety of so-called fourth-generation concepts, like small modular reactors, which could prove to be more flexible in size and safer than the old designs being used now. And the potential payoff from fusion is so great it's surely worth continuing experiments and prototypes. Indeed, it would be hard to think of a more inspiring challenge for young engineers than devising clean and economical energy systems for the world. And it is engineering more than science. And there may be some engineers in the audience today, and I think I should remind them of one of the jokes which they like best. It's a cartoon in an old New Yorker which shows two beavers looking up at a big hydroelectric dam. One beaver says to the other, "I didn't actually build it, but it's based on my idea." And that exemplifies how armchair theory doesn't get you very far. You need to follow it up with technology, and making things that work and that people want is the huge challenge which engineers need to reach. And as I say, an idealistic challenge is to provide clean and affordable energy for the entire world. Just as a digression, if we don't succeed in controlling CO2 emissions, some people say we need to engineer the climate by, for instance, putting lots of opaque stuff in the upper atmosphere to cool the Earth down by reducing the amount of sunlight hitting the ground, or to extract carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and undo the geoengineering we've done already by burning fossil fuels. The first kind is rather dangerous because we can't predict the runaway effects. The second kind is benign but much more expensive and difficult. So let's hope we don't have to do either. Well, we should be evangelists for new technology. Without it, the world can't provide food and sustainable energy for an expanding and more demanding population. But we need wisely directed technology. Indeed, many of us are anxious that it's advancing so fast in some areas that we may not properly cope with it. And that's why we might have a bumpy ride through this century. And my book expands on these concerns. We're ever more dependent on elaborate networks, electric power grids, air traffic control, international finance, just-in-time delivery, globally dispersed manufacturing, and so forth. Unless these globalized networks are highly resilient, their manifest benefits could be outweighed by catastrophic, albeit rare, breakdowns, real-world analogues of what happened to the financial system in 2008. Our cities will be paralyzed without electricity, supermarket shelves empty within days if supply chains were disrupted. Air travel can spread a pandemic worldwide within days, and social media can spread panic and rumor and psychic and economic contagion literally at the speed of light. Advances in microbiology, diagnostics, vaccines, and antibiotics offer prospects of containing pandemics as well as other huge health benefits. But the same research has controversial aspects. For instance, in 2012, groups in Wisconsin and in Holland showed it was surprisingly easy to make the flu virus both more virulent and more transmissible. To some, this was a scary portent of things to come, and the US federal government stopped funding in 2016 these so-called gain-of-function experiments. And the new CRISPR-Cas9 technique for gene editing is hugely promising, but there are ethical concerns about, for instance, recent Chinese experiments on human embryos, and also worries about possible runaway consequences of gene-drive programs to wipe out species. It may be okay to wipe out the mosquito that carries the Zika virus, but some people talk about wiping out invasive mammal species, like the grey squirrel in England, which is competing all too successfully with the brown one. But we have to be careful about runaway consequences of this kind. For all these biotech techniques, regulation is needed. But I'd worry that whatever regulations are imposed on prudential or ethical grounds can't be enforced worldwide, any more than the drug laws can or the tax laws can. Whatever can be done will be done by someone somewhere. And that's a nightmare. Whereas an atomic bomb can't be built without large-scale special-purpose facilities, which can be monitored easily, biotech involves small-scale, dual-use equipment. Indeed, biohacking is burgeoning even as a hobby and competitive game. And we know all too well that technical expertise doesn't guarantee balanced rationality. The global village will have its village idiots, and they'll have global range. The rising empowerment of tech-savvy groups, or even individuals, empowered by bio as well as cybertechnology, will pose an intractable challenge to governments and aggravate the tension between freedom, privacy, and security. These concerns, I think, are relatively near term, within 10 or 15 years. What about 2050 and beyond? On the bio front, we might expect two things: a better understanding of what combination of genes determines key human characteristics, looks and intelligence, such like, plus the ability to synthesize genomes with those combinations by artificial means. That's something that may happen. And indeed, the great physicist Freeman Dyson conjectures at a time when children will be able to design and create new organisms, just as routinely as his generation played with chemistry sets. Well, if it indeed becomes possible to, as it were, play God on a kitchen table, then our ecology and even our species may not long survive unscathed. And what about another transformative technology? Robotics and artificial intelligence. There have been exciting recent advances in generalized machine learning. DeepMind, a London company now owned by Google, achieved in the last year or two a remarkable feat. Its computer beat the world champions in the games of Go and chess, and did many other things like doing protein folding calculations. It was just given the rules and worked out strategy by itself. It's not like 20 years ago when Kasparov was beaten by an IBM computer, because that was programmed by expert players. What happens now is that the computer plays against itself thousands of times in a single day, and the programmers don't themselves know how the machines learn to make surprisingly insightful decisions. It is, of course, the speed of computers, consequence of Moore's law, which allows them to succeed by brute force methods. They learn to identify dogs, cats, and human faces by crunching through millions of images, not the way babies learn. They learn to translate by reading millions of pages of multilingual text. In Europe, they read EU documents. Their boredom threshold is infinite. Now, the implications of all this for our society are already ambivalent. If we're sentenced to a term in prison, recommended for surgery, or even given a poor credit rating, we'd expect the reasons to be accessible to us and contestable by us. If such decisions were entirely delegated to an algorithm, we'd be entitled to feel uneasy, even if presented with compelling evidence that, on average, the machines made better decisions than the humans they had usurped. And AI systems will become more intrusive and pervasive. Records of all our movements, our health and our financial transactions will be in the cloud, managed by a multinational quasi-monopoly. The data may be used for benign reasons, like medical research, but its availability to internet companies is already shifting the balance of power from governments to globe-spanning conglomerates. And there'll be other privacy concerns. Are you happy if a random stranger sitting near you in a restaurant can, via facial recognition, identify you and invade your privacy? Or if fake videos become so convincing that visual evidence can no longer be trusted? Computers succeed by reinforced learning on big training sets. And incidentally, the pioneer of many of these was Professor Jeff Hinton here 20 years ago, but only more recently has the computer speed reached a level when they can take advantage of his ideas. But can machines learn about human behavior? This involves observing actual people in real homes and workplaces. And the machine would feel sensorily deprived by the slowness of real life. It's like us watching trees grow, and it would be bewildered. To quote Stuart Russell, who's a leading AI theorist at Berkeley, he said, I quote, "The machine could try all kinds of things: scrambling eggs, stacking wooden blocks, chewing wires, poking its finger into electric outlets, but nothing will produce a strong enough feedback loop to convince the computer it was on the right track and lead it to the next action. It needs to repeat the same thing many, many times." And robots are still clumsier than a child in moving pieces on a real chessboard. They can't jump from tree to tree like a squirrel, though a Boston Dynamics robot, here it is, can do backflops, although rather clumsily. But sensor technology is advancing fast. Another advantage that humans have is that the Go-playing computer used hundreds of kilowatts of power, but the brain of its human challenger used about 30 watts. That's like a small light bulb. And he can do many other things apart from playing Go. But AI will take over many kinds of work. Not just manual work. Indeed, plumbing and gardening will be among the hardest jobs to automate. But it will do routine legal work, medical diagnostics, and even surgery, complementing, if not replacing, those who now do these things. And the big social and economic question, of course, is this: will this new machine age, like earlier disruptive technologies, the car for instance, create as many jobs as it destroys? Or is it really different this time? The money earned by robots could generate huge wealth for an elite. But as I suggest in my book, to preserve a healthy society will require massive redistribution of that income to ensure that everyone has at least a living wage. This shouldn't be a handout, but should be achieved by creating huge numbers of upgraded public service jobs where the human element is crucial, jobs which are now undervalued and where demand is huge and unmet, especially carers for old, teaching assistants for young, but also custodians, gardeners in public parks, and so forth. If enough such jobs can be created to replace the mind-numbing existing jobs in call centers and Amazon's warehouses, that will surely be a win-win situation, providing jobs where human qualities are needed for those who do now mind-numbing work. I can see this change happening in China, in Scandinavia, perhaps in Canada, but less so perhaps in the United States and England. But let's look still further ahead. How human-like will these future robots be? It can deal with many things that don't require to be like a human. AI can cope with fast changing networks, traffic flow or electric grids, for instance. And indeed, the Chinese could have an efficient planned economy of a kind that Marx could only dream of. And AI can help science too. Perhaps it can find the recipe for a high-temperature superconductor or settle whether string theory can really describe our universe. But what if a machine developed a mind of its own? Would it stay docile or go rogue? Popular cultures, of course, portray a dark side, where AI gets out of its box, infiltrates the internet and the Internet of Things, and pursues goals misaligned with human interests, or even treats humans as an encumbrance. Well, some AI pundits take this seriously and think the field already needs guidelines, just as biotech does. But others, like for instance Rodney Brooks, inventor of the Baxter robot and the Roomba vacuum cleaner, regard these concerns as premature. He thinks it will be a long time before artificial intelligence will worry us more than real stupidity. But be it as it may, it's likely that society will be transformed by autonomous robots, even though the jury's out on whether they'll be idiot savants or display superhuman capabilities. This man, Ray Kurzweil, who now works at Google, is a futurologist who argues that once machines have surpassed human capabilities, they could themselves design and assemble a new generation of even more powerful ones, an intelligence explosion. He wrote a book called The Age of Spiritual Machines, where he predicted that humans would transcend biology by merging with computers. In old-style spiritualist parlance, they would go over to the other side. We then confront the classic philosophical problem of personal identity. Could your brain be downloaded into a machine? If so, in what sense would it still be you? Should you be relaxed about your original body then being destroyed? What would happen if several clones were made of you? These are ancient conundrums for philosophers, but practical ethicists may need to address them later in the century, certainly if Kurzweil is right. But Kurzweil is worried that his nirvana may not happen in his lifetime. So he wants his body frozen in liquid nitrogen until this state is reached. And there's a company in Arizona that will freeze and store your body so that when immortality is on offer, you can be resurrected or your brain downloaded. I was surprised to find that 3 of my academic colleagues in England had gone in for this so-called cryonics. 2 had paid the full whack, about $80,000. The third took the cut price offer of just having his head frozen. I was glad that all 3 were from Oxford and not from my university. And I told them that I'd rather end my days at an English churchyard than an American refrigerator. But of course, research on aging is being seriously prioritized. But will the benefits be incremental, or is aging a disease that can be cured? Dramatic life extension will plainly be a real wild card in the population projections I discussed earlier. But it may happen, along with human enhancement in other forms. It's at least surely on the cards that human beings, their mentality and their physique, may become malleable through the deployment of genetic modification and cyborg technologies linking us to some machine. Moreover, this future evolution, a kind of secular intelligent design, would take only centuries, in contrast to the thousands of centuries needed for Darwinian evolution. And this is a game changer. When we admire the literature and artifacts that have survived from antiquity, we feel an affinity across a time gulf of thousands of years with those ancient artists and their civilizations. But we can have zero confidence that the dominant intelligences a few centuries hence will have any emotional resonance with us, even though they may have an algorithmic understanding of how we behaved. And now I turn to another technology, space. It's beyond our Earth, in environments hostile to humans, that cyborg and AI technologies will have the most spectacular scope, in my opinion, and where these changes will happen fastest and should worry us less. During this century, the whole solar system will be explored by swarms of miniaturized probes, far more advanced than the ones we've had up till now, like Cassini, which spent 13 years studying Saturn and its moons, on the Rosetta, which brought back pictures of a comet there's a robot sent by the European Space Agency, and of course the NASA probe that transmitted amazing pictures from Pluto, 20,000 times further away than the moon. Think back to the computers and phones of the 1990s, when probes like these were designed, and realize how much better we can do today. So the next step will be the deployment in space of robotic fabricators, which can build large structures, for instance, giant telescopes with huge gossamer-thin mirrors assembled under zero gravity, and also send whole flotillas of tiny spacecraft to the outer solar system. But what about manned spaceflight? The practical case gets ever weaker with each advance in robotics and miniaturization. So will it have a resurgence? It's 50 years since Neil Armstrong's one small step, and I cherish this picture signed for me a few years ago by 7 of the Apollo astronauts. As we know, in the 1960s there was a space race against the Russians. NASA got over 4% of the US federal budget. And had that pace continued, after the moon landings, there would have been footprints on Mars long before today. But of course, once the race to the moon was won, there was no motive for America to continue this requisite expenditure. It's now about 0.6% rather than 4%. Hundreds of more people have ventured into space subsequently, but anticlimactically, they've done no more than circle the Earth in low orbits, many in the International Space Station. They only make news when something goes wrong, when the toilet fails, for instance, or when they perform stunts like Chris Hadfield playing his guitar in space. So will there be any inspirational Apollo-style projects? There's no denying that NASA's Curiosity robot, now trundling across a giant Martian crater, you can see its tire marks about a quarter of the way up there, that may miss some features that a human geologist would miss. But machine learning is advancing fast. In contrast, the cost gap between manned and unmanned missions remains huge. And NASA's manned program, ever since Apollo, has been impeded by public and political pressure into being very risk-averse. The space shuttle failed twice in 135 launches. Astronauts or test pilots would willingly accept a 2% level of risk, but the shuttle had unwisely been promoted as safe for civilians. So each of those 2 failures, you may recall, caused a national trauma and was followed by a hiatus while costly efforts were made with not much effect to reduce the risk still further. But because of this safety culture, NASA will confront political obstacles in achieving any grand goal within a feasible budget. China has the resources, the Jewish government, and maybe the willingness to undertake an Apollo-style program. But leaving aside the Chinese, I think the future of manned spaceflight lies with privately funded adventurers prepared to participate in a cut-price program far riskier than Western nations could impose on publicly supported civilians. Elon Musk's SpaceX and Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin will soon offer orbital flights to paying customers. If I were an American taxpayer, I would only support NASA's unmanned program. I'd argue that private enterprise ventures, bringing a Silicon Valley culture into a domain long dominated by NASA and a few aerospace conglomerates, should front all manned missions as cut-price, high-risk ventures. There'd still be many volunteers, some perhaps even accepting one-way tickets, driven by the same motives as early explorers, mountaineers, and the like. The phrase space tourism should be avoided. It lulls people into believing that these ventures are routine and low risk. If that's a perception, the inevitable accidents will be as traumatic as those of the space station were. These exploits must be sold as dangerous sports or intrepid exploration. But by 2100, I think some thrill seekers may have established bases independent from the Earth, probably on Mars or maybe on asteroids. And Musk himself, who I think is 47 years old, says he wants to die on Mars, but not on impact. And he might make this. But don't ever expect mass emigration from Earth. Nowhere in our solar system offers an environment even as clement as the Antarctic or the top of Everest. And here I disagree strongly with Musk and my late colleague Stephen Hawking. It's a dangerous delusion to think that space offers an escape from Earth's problems. Dealing with climate change on Earth is hard, but it's a doddle compared to terraforming Mars. There's no planet B for ordinary risk-averse people. Nonetheless, we should cheer on these brave space adventurers because they'll have a pivotal role in spearheading the post-human future and determining what happens in the 22nd century and far beyond. This is why. They'll be ill-adapted to their new habitat, so they'll have a more compelling incentive than those of us here on Earth to redesign themselves. They'll harness the super-powerful genetic and cyborg technologies that will be developed in coming decades. These techniques will, one hopes, be restrained here on Earth on prudential and ethical grounds. But the settlers on Mars, they'll be beyond the clutches of the regulators. And we should surely wish them good luck in modifying their progeny to adapt to this alien environment. So it's these spacefaring adventurers, not those of us comfortably adapted to life on Earth, who will spearhead the post-human era. Moreover, if they make the transition to fully inorganic intelligences, they won't need an atmosphere. They may prefer zero-G, especially for constructing massive artifacts. So it's in deep space, not on Earth, nor even perhaps on Mars, that non-biological brains may develop powers that humans can't even imagine. Well, when will this happen? Few doubt that machines will gradually surpass or enhance more and more of our distinctively human capabilities. Roy Kurzweil, as I said, thinks it'll happen in a few decades. The cautious may envisage centuries. But either way, these timescales are just an instant compared to the timescale of 4 billion years, which it's taken for Darwinian evolution to get from the first life to our present biosphere. So the outcome of future technological evolution could surpass humans by as much as we intellectually surpass slime mold, for instance. That's because the sun's been shining for 4.5 billion years, but it's got 6 billion years more before the fuel runs out. And the expanding universe will continue, perhaps forever. To quote Woody Allen, eternity is very long, especially towards the end. So we may not even be at the halfway stage of evolution. So even if life originated only on the Earth, it need not remain a trivial feature of the cosmos. Humans could jumpstart a diaspora whereby ever more complex intelligence spreads through the whole galaxy. Vast self-reproducing machines, transmitting DNA, instructions for 3D printers or such like. Indeed, interstellar voyages would hold no terrors for near immortal electronic intelligences. Well, this raises the question astronomers are most often asked. Is there life out there already, or are the rest of the domains in the galaxy waiting for our progeny? I think we all agree we don't yet know. Well, actually not all. I get letters from people who say they've met the aliens, they've been abducted by them and such like. And I write back to these people and I say, do they really think that if the aliens had made a huge effort to come here, that they'd make a corn circle or two, meet one or two well-known cranks and go away again? Seems unlikely. And the second thing I say is that these people should write to each other and not write to me. Well, more seriously, we do now know that there's no advanced life anywhere in our solar system. There might be some simple life on the red planet. There might be something swimming around on the ocean under the ice of Enceladus, a moon of Saturn. But let's widen our horizons to the realm of the stars. And we've learnt in the last 2 decades something really, really exciting, which is that most stars in the sky are orbited by retinues of planets, just as the sun is. But the evidence so far is mainly indirect. We don't observe the planets, but we detect its influence on the motion or brightness of the star it's orbiting. But we know something about these statistics. We know that almost every star has a planet around it, and 1 in every 6 stars has an Earth-sized planet. And many of those Earth-sized planets are in the so-called habitable zone, at a distance from a star such that water can exist, neither boiling away nor staying frozen. And some of these systems have been found. There's a remarkable system which is a miniature solar system. Its star is a so-called M dwarf, 100 times fainter than our sun, and there are 7 planets orbiting around it. Their years are only a few Earth days, 1.5 Earth days for the innermost one, about 18 for the outermost one. This is a very small solar system. And these are very unearthly. We have no idea what they might look like. This is an artist's impression, what it might be like on one of them. But they're probably tidally locked so that they present the same face to their star. One hemisphere always in the light, the other always in dark. So there'd be a kind of apartheid. Everyone would be on the bright side, except for the astronomers who'd be on the other side. Well, can we actually get a picture of these planets, rather than inferring their presence from their transit of the star? And that's very hard. To realize how hard, suppose that an alien astronomer with a big telescope was looking at the Earth from, say, 30 light years away, the distance of a nearby star. The sun would look an ordinary star, and our Earth would seem, in Carl Sagan's famous phrase, a pale blue dot, very close in the sky to its star, our sun, which outshines it by many billions, a firefly next to a searchlight. But the aliens could learn quite a bit about this pale blue dot, because the shade of blue would be slightly different, depending on whether the Pacific Ocean or the landmass of Eurasia was facing them. So they could infer that there were continents and oceans and the length of our day, and something about the climate by analyzing the light reflected from the planet. We can't do that yet, but the next generation of telescopes will be able to. Within 10 years, this telescope here, built by the European Southern Observatory, called the Extremely Large Telescope. They're not very imaginative in their nomenclature in Europe. This has a 39-meter diameter mirror. That's probably a bit bigger than the length of this room, a mosaic of 800 pieces. And that instrument will be able to draw inferences, like I've just sketched, about Earth-like planets orbiting other stars. Surely an exciting expectation in the next decade or two. Well, habitable doesn't mean inhabited. But for most of us, that's the number one question. We still don't know the likelihood about life developing and evolving. We don't even know how life started on the Earth. It could have been a rare fluke, or it could have been something which happened inevitably and would happen in any similar environment. But the question, are we alone, fascinates so many that I think SETI searches are worthwhile, even though the chance of success is small. But that's a topic for a different lecture, or maybe the question period. Let me conclude briefly by focusing back closer to the here and now. Even in the concertinaed cosmic timeline, extending billions of years into the future as well as into the past, we're living in a special century. It's the first in Earth's history when one species, ours, is empowered to determine the fate of the entire biosphere, for good or for ill. The century when humans jumpstart the transition to entities, organic or electronic, that far transcend our limitations and maybe spread far beyond the Earth, or to take a darker view, the century when our follies could foreclose the immense future potential and leave an anarchic and depleted planet. My book emphasizes how our society is brittle, interconnected, and vulnerable. I argue that we fret unduly about small risks, air crashes, carcinogens in food, low radiation doses, etc., but we're in denial about some newly emergent threats which could be globally devastating. Some are environmental, the pressures of a growing and more demanding population on the climate. Others are the potential downsides of novel technology. A wise mantra is that the unfamiliar is not the same as the improbable. And of course, most of the challenges are global. Coping with potential shortages of food, water, and resources, and transitioning to low-carbon energy can't be solved by each nation separately, nor can the regulation of potentially threatening innovations. Indeed, a key issue is whether we need to give up some national sovereignty to new organizations along the line of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the World Health Organization, etc. And do scientists have any special obligation? I think they do, to promote beneficial application of their work and to warn against the downsides. Universities can use their staff's expertise and their convening power to assess which scary scenarios, echo threats or risk for misapplied technologies can be dismissed as science fiction, but how best to avoid the ones that seem serious. But sadly, of course, politicians won't prioritize these global and long-term measures unless enough voters endorse such policies. So scientists must enhance their leverage by involvement with NGOs, by blogging and journalism, and by enlisting charismatic individuals and the media to amplify their voice. Two recent instances. The papal encyclical in 2015 had a worldwide influence in the lead-up to the Paris Climate Conference in December of that year. The Pope got a standing ovation at the UN. He's got 1 billion followers, and there's no gainsaying the Church's global reach, long-term vision, and concern for the world's poor. And more parochially, back in my country, in England, a not very enlightened minister has introduced legislation to ban non-reusable drinking straws and things like that. And I don't think he'd have done this at all had it not been for the efforts of our secular Pope, David Attenborough, and his BBC programs Blue Planet, especially the iconic images of albatrosses returning to their nest and coughing up plastic waste rather than food for the young in their nests. That's an iconic picture, rather like the polar bear on the melting ice floe is in the climate campaigns. So we need these iconic figures, and it's encouraging to witness more activists among the young. We've had so much of this recently, and we should surely welcome it. It's unsurprising that they can hope to live to the end of a century, and their campaigning's welcome, and their commitment gives ground for hope. So, spaceship Earth is hurtling through the void. Its passengers are anxious and fractious. their life support systems vulnerable to disruption and breakdown. But there's too little planning, too little long-term horizon scanning. We need to think globally, we need to think rationally, we need to think long-term, empowered by 21st century technology, but guided by values that science alone can't provide. And I give the very last word to one of my scientific heroes, the eloquent biologist Peter Medawar. I quote, "The bells that toll for mankind are like the bells of alpine cattle. They're attached to our own necks, and it must be our fault if they don't make a tuneful and melodious sound." Thank you for listening. Okay. Right. Good. Right.
So thank you very much, Lord Rees. You've certainly given us a lot of food for thought, not all of it completely savory or palatable, but there it is, and some upbeat notes in it with, I think many of us are, cheered that at least gardening looks like a good place to be, that we can't be completely replaced, and it's actually good for everything as far as I can tell. So thank you very much. And so now I'll just Lord Rees will answer the questions, but I'll pick out people that would like to pose a question for him. So, Chris.
I'm very interested in finding out what the Astronomer Royal has to do. Now, I know about the functions of a poet laureate, but I don't know about it. How far back does the office go? I think Dr. Edmund Halley was Astronomer Royal once, and how long is it? Is it a short-term job, or is it till your death or resignation,
Okay.
or what?
Yes. Well, of course, it was a real job, because in 1675 the Royal Observatory at Greenwich was built, and its director, who was in fact the first publicly funded scientist, was called the Astronomer Royal. And that continued until the 1960s, when Greenwich became a museum, and of course we moved telescopes then to bright, cloudier or less cloudy skies in Canary Islands, Hawaii and Chile. And the title was kept, but then given as a sort of honorary title to a senior astronomer. And honestly, there are no particular duties apart from to propagandize astronomy a bit. And so I like to say duties are so exiguous, they can be performed posthumously.
So your term will never end.
Right.
So let's have another question here.
An astronomical question. Do you have a plan to protect us from the next Carrington event? It sounds like it could have quite serious effects.
Yes, let me explain for the audience that a Carrington event is a very, very strong solar flare which produces charged particles that impact the Earth and can mess up the magnetosphere and produce uncontrollable currents in the grid and perhaps disrupt a whole lot of the internet. Okay, I think it's very hard to know how to defend against it apart from hardening the equipment, but we can predict it better because we can at least get 2 days notice if we are monitoring the sun very carefully, because it takes about 2 days for the fast particles produced in a huge solar flare to get to the Earth. So we can get a couple of days warning, but apart from that, all we can do is make sure that our equipment is as well protected as possible.
But is there any planning at all by any government?
Well, there's a recent NASA satellite launched, the aim of which was to study solar flares in this way for this particular reason, and certainly all those who put satellites in orbit, for instance, are more aware of this and therefore put in better shielding than they would have done before.
So, question here.
So you mentioned that retrieval of carbon from the atmosphere as a plan B, in particular because you think it's going to be fairly expensive as opposed to governments actually changing carbon output. And I guess I have a more pessimistic view. You know, for example, Canada has a federal election coming up, and I'm not convinced Canadians will vote well given what the different parties' plans are for their carbon emissions. But I guess my question is, when do you think, because you see this as a plan B, to have technologies to be able to efficiently retrieve carbon and other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, when do you think we will reach that tipping point when we need to have that technology in action?
Well, as I say, I would hope that we can quickly develop clean energy so that the carbon concentration doesn't get up so high we expect a tipping point. And so my top priority would be to raise the level of research and development into clean energy in all its forms, up to the level of medical research or defense research. And indeed, there has been a first step towards this after the Paris Climate Conference. 20 nations agreed to something called Mission Innovation, which involved doubling publicly funded R&D by 2020. So I would hope that. But you're also thinking about what do we do in terms of geoengineering if the climate change does look as though it's getting to a runaway state, and putting stuff up into the upper atmosphere to prevent some sunlight getting down to the ground. That is frighteningly cheap. It could be done by one nation, but the trouble is that the effects aren't entirely predictable, and it's going to be a big problem if we have to do that, because we can't be quite sure of what the effects would be of messing up with the upper atmosphere in a big way. And of course, if it was done internationally, there'd be big disagreements, because different countries would want to turn down the thermostat to a different extent. And I think the only beneficiary would be lawyers, because if nations could litigate about bad weather, that's a new arena for lawyers, so they would benefit, but others wouldn't. On the other hand, the second part of that slide talked about a more benign kind of geoengineering, which is to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere and sort of undo the geoengineering we've done. And this would be, I think, harmless. You try and bring it down in terms of concentration of CO2 to the pre-industrial level, but at the moment, ideas to do this would need quite a big fraction of the world's electricity supply, so it's not feasible. But if that could be done, that would be acceptable, but that's not really feasible. On the other hand, putting stuff in the upper atmosphere is feasible, but we should think very hard before we try to do it.
Okay, question here.
You spoke to the potential of Canada to be able to deal with restructuring its economy with AI as opposed to Britain and the United States. What gives you hope that we can do that?
This is about the redeployment of labour. Yes,
that's correct.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my feeling is that it's deplorable how few jobs there are for caring for old people, certainly in my country and in many others. I think this requires high taxation of the companies and those who make money out of this to redistribute wealth, to set up huge numbers of publicly funded jobs. And this can be done in China, obviously. It can be done probably in Scandinavia because they accept a higher tax rate in return for a better welfare state than the United States does, for instance. So that's why I thought that China can do this, Scandinavia can. I won't comment on whether Canada can, but I think the US can't. And under our present government, the UK can't either, because they are so allergic to higher tax rates.
In the case of talking to climate change deniers, have you found any particularly compelling arguments or effective arguments that have helped you change their minds, or is there nothing that can be said to them?
Well, I should say I'm myself not an expert, but I think there is a change in there's much greater awareness thanks to all the demonstrations, and I think everyone is more familiar with the science and accepts this is happening. And I think that'll happen because 20 years from now, we'll have a much longer time base, and it'll be very much clearer whether indeed the climate is changing and the temperature is rising. Up till now, some of the people who are skeptical have said, well, there are decade-scale fluctuations, and we've just seen those and they level off. But the longer the time base of data, the more convincing it will be whether or not there is this secular change. And I think that's going to make people realize what is happening. But then, as I say, the question of how urgent it is to deal with it involves these ethical issues about how much we sacrifice now to remove risk from future generations. Because clearly there'll be no tremendous disaster except for local ones in the next 10 or 20 years, but there could be a global disaster at the end of a century.
If you can get a microphone a bit.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for coming this evening. Wonderful to hear from you. As the founder of the Center for the Study of Existential Risk, what keeps you up at 4 a.m.?
Sorry?
What wakes you up at 4 a.m.?
Well, I mean, in the last 2 nights it's been jet lag. But more seriously, I worry in the short term about bio and cyber. These may not be completely global, but the point is that we know how much disruption could be caused because our world is so fragile. And I worry particularly because I think society is fragile. Let's take an example of a pandemic. In the Middle Ages, the Black Death, bubonic plague, killed about half the population of some towns. The rest went on resignedly. But if we had a pandemic now, whether natural or engineered, then I think once the number of cases overwhelmed hospitals, there'd be a risk of social breakdown. And that could happen before the number of cases reached even 1% of the population. So I think our expectations are so high that a social breakdown is more likely now. And of course, another point is that because of the world being so interconnected, a serious catastrophe in one continent will spread globally. Some of you may know Jared Diamond's book called Collapse, when particular domains, particular continents collapse. We couldn't have a collapse in one continent without the rest being affected. So I worry that the global risks are now things we need to worry about. If I can just add a footnote, when people know I'm an astronomer, they say, do I worry about asteroid impacts and such like? And of course, one does worry about those, but the thing about asteroid impact is we can quantify it, and we know what that risk is. It's not zero, but it's quite small, and it's big enough that it's worth spending a 9-figure sum worldwide every year to try and insure against it and develop ways to deflect these asteroids. I think we agree to that. But what worries me are these other emergent threats which didn't exist in the past and are caused by our collective impact on the planet or by our new technology. Those are much, much bigger. And of course, the first such risk was during the Cold War. If there'd been a exchange of 50,000 nuclear weapons on each side, it would have destroyed the fabric of North America and Europe. And if you read the memoirs of McNamara and people like that, they would say that the risk of that happening was 1 in 3 or 1 in 6 or something like that. And I think if we in the public who were alive then had realized just how big that risk was, I'm not sure if we'd have supported the standard policy of mutual deterrence. I personally would not. I would not have accepted even a 1 in 6 risk of destroying the fabric of the Northern Hemisphere, even if the alternative was a certain takeover by the Soviet Union. And I don't think people really realized that the threat was quite so big.
Related to what you just said about the pandemic, would you consider antibiotic resistance as one of the major threats to humanity?
Antibiotic resistance, well, certainly if we can't deal with it or produce enough new antibiotics, this is going to be serious because it's going to take us back to the situation 100 years ago when even routine surgical operations couldn't be done because of the risk of infection. And it's going to cause many millions of deaths. So it's going to be a really severe setback if we can't generate enough new antibiotics and, of course, cut down the excessive use of antibiotics by the Americans giving them to cows and things like that. So it's a very serious threat. But it's very hard to think of any threat that's going to kill everyone off, but we're talking about those that will cause a setback to civilization.
Okay, another question. You were talking about the development of anti-geriatric drugs and the end of aging. What is your prediction as to the development of these type of drugs or technologies, and what effect would that have on the global population?
So, anti-aging drugs.
Anti-aging drugs or technologies.
Yes. Well, I mean, I've got no expertise in this, but I've talked to people, and I mean, there's a lot of charlatans in the field, but there are also lots of serious people who suspect that we can, to some extent, by affecting the end of the chromosomes and all that, extend human life. Of course, if it was a drastic extension, then it would have huge sociological implications. Will we have multi-generational families? Would the age of menopause go up, etc.? So it would make huge changes to the whole of society. And of course, it would enhance the population very, very much. So as to how likely this is, I just don't know. But of course, the other issue is whether it's an extension of healthy life, and whether it will also extend the period of dependency at the end of life. I think, incidentally, that we're going to have to rethink the very high focus of medical attention on the very end of life, and also perhaps on very premature babies. I think these are things where ethics may have to change somewhat. And so I'm a supporter of assisted dying campaigns in Britain. But on the other hand, I would welcome anything that extends healthy life.
So one last question here.
Yeah. Less gloomy than that last one was. Yeah, okay. Yeah.
So you discussed the prospect of having sort of, miniature robotics, or even humans sort of transcending to some sort of, I guess, robotic or electronic state and traversing the cosmos. And I guess my question is, oh, sorry, I'm trying to, I just don't.
Can you speak a bit louder?
I didn't realize it wasn't very loud. So the reality potentially of traversing the cosmos in electronic form, and the still very long timescales that would require, how that could be affected by electronics being damaged by things like cosmic rays, and what that would mean for this life form if it were in some electronic form, the reality of everything else that's out there. If it takes 1 million years for some robot to travel across a galaxy, what state it's likely to be in once it gets there?
Well, again, obviously, I don't know, but I mean, I was making the point that if the intelligence is not flesh and blood, but is electronic, then it may be near immortal, and it may be able to traverse these huge distances. And incidentally, this has a consequence for the strategy for SETI programs. I mentioned that I'm involved in the SETI program being bankrolled by Mr. Yuri Milner in California. And of course, people are looking for some sort of message, or they're looking for evidence of a civilization rather like ours. My view is that if we detected anything, it would be far more likely to be some kind of electronic entity of the kind I've envisaged, which would be the creation of some long-dead flesh and blood civilization. And the reason I say that is that, although we've no idea how the other planet's biosphere would develop, let's suppose it tracked what had happened on the Earth. Then what's happened on the Earth is we've had nearly 4 billion years of life evolving. Then we've had the emergence of intelligence, and we've had a few millennia of technological civilization. And the machines may take over within the next millennium. and then the machines could go on for billions of years. So if there was some other planet on which evolution had proceeded like on the Earth, it's most unlikely that it would be synchronized so that we caught it in the thin sliver of time, a few millennia, when it's dominated by a flesh and blood civilization, a collective group. Either it'll be behind us and we'll see nothing, or it will be ahead and its manifestations will be something electronic. So I think that if we detect anything on SETI programs which is manifestly artificial, it'll be electronic, not a flesh and blood civilization. And incidentally, this gives, I think, a good answer to the so-called Fermi paradox. If there's life out there, why don't we know about it? The reason it gives an answer, or a partial answer, is that Darwinian evolution favors two things. One is intelligence, the other is aggression. There's no particular reason why these electronic machines may be designing themselves would be aggressive. They may be out there in huge numbers, leading a contemplative life and not wanting to expand. So I think the idea that any intelligence would be expansionist is perhaps parochial, or it's sort of chauvinistic to flesh and blood civilization, whereas these might be quite different. So I think we should be open-minded about electronic intelligences that we could detect.
Well, that's sort of an upbeat note, because given that all of our undergraduates are well equipped with electronic devices and will be the first to know. So thank you very much.
So echoing Ray, I'd also like to thank Lord Rees for this exciting glimpse into the future. Population growth, urbanization, climate change, global warming, energy, artificial intelligence, and robotics. All of these topics in one stimulating lecture certainly give us much fodder for discussion. You've certainly set the bar very high for future lectures. So for that, we also thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge the dedicated staff and volunteers who came together to make this evening such a success. And once again, thank you to the Martin family. Your generosity and multi-generational support to the University of Toronto make a profound impact for generations of scholars to come. This lecture is just one example of what your dedication to the University of Toronto has created. Thank you all for coming this evening. Have a wonderful evening.